Today, we're going to talk about how behavioral science can help financial services players, particularly in advisory relationships, in order to help their clients achieve their long-term financial goals. And in the process of doing that, this obviously ensures things like greater share of wallet, more referrals, and just better customer acquisition by using some of these behavioral hacks that I'm going to introduce. We're going to talk today about a concept called framing. Now, in decision science, framing effects are among the most powerful elements that influence our decisions, often without us really realizing it. To give you a practical definition and example, framing effects in the rational economic model shouldn't work. We shouldn't be influenced by how a decision is presented to us. For example, if we're talking about a product that has a 5% fail rate versus a 95% success rate, a rational decision maker shouldn't be influenced one way or the other about that kind of product. But in reality, we are. Most people would have chosen to take the product that has a 95% success rate, even though objectively they're the same number, they're the same success rate. So what is the truth in reality is that how we present information to other people so that they can make a decision does have a significant impact on how that person makes a decision. Now, marketers have known this stuff for a very long time, so I'm going to just break this down in a simple topical way by introducing three particular kinds of frames that I think are particularly relevant to the financial services industry. And they're attribute choice frames, risk-based framing, and goal-based framing. Now, the last one is my favorite, and we'll get to that at the end. So here's how they work. An attribute-based frame is effectively highlighting the positive attributes or the negative attributes of a product so that a customer will either take a decision or refrain from making a decision, keep the status quo. And the example that comes to mind frequently, for me anyway, is loyalty programs through credit card companies. So when you are trying to get a customer to make a decision to use your product or buy your product in the first place, sign up for it, if you're highlighting the positive, that is likely to get your client to take an action, much more likely to, in fact. So if you're trying to get a client to sign up for, I don't know, let's say this is a business traveler, your particular brand of card, maybe it's an American Express, by highlighting that you'll have 10 free lounge visits at any lounge around the world, this positive frame is more likely to encourage him or her to sign up for your product. Now, to flip that a little bit, if we're talking about how do we use the negative frame, well, in this case, what we can do is we can talk about how Mr. or Mrs. Customer will lose all of these points if they switch their product from one to the other. So in this example, a negative frame encouraged the customer to keep the product that they already have. So it's a great retention communication strategy. So the only real hard part, or the challenge I would say, to using this kind of frame properly is to understand which particular features or attributes of your product are the ones to highlight. Now, I gave you an example. I primed you for the business traveler, and for this traveler, things like the free lounge access or losing access to that lounge would be a more relevant attribute to discuss. But if your persona or your customer group that you're focusing on were different, or not business travelers, you might need to identify different pieces or different attributes. The second kind of frame that is most commonly used in investment decisions or in long-term borrowing decisions is called risk-based framing. Now, this particular kind of frame is actually quite simple to explain, a little bit difficult to get right, but I'll give you a hack that'll make this quite simple. Risk-based framing works like this. If you're trying to get Mr. or Mrs. Customer to make a more risky investment versus, let's say, something like a fixed deposit with a guaranteed interest rate, highlighting the gain is the most likely way to help that client make a decision that would imply taking some more risk. The biggest challenge to getting this frame right is identifying how much reward Mr. or Mrs. Customer would expect to take on some additional risk. So if you want to get your customer to avoid taking the risky decision, you would of course do the opposite. You would emphasize the negative and talk lots about the loss. But there's a very easy rule of thumb in here, and lots of experiments have been run over the years to talk about this. It's actually another behavioral bias. It's called loss aversion. And in plain language, what this means is customers are generally twice as averse to risk as they are to rewarded gain. Now, even plainer language, if you give Mr. or Mrs. Customer a bet where they'll have $100 and they have an equal chance of losing 100 or making 100, most won't take that bet. To take that bet, you would need to have it be with that same $100 bet, they could lose 100 or make 200. So generally speaking, when you're trying to present a positive frame to a customer, if you present something simplistic like this, if you start with 50,000 rupees, then 10 years from now, you would have this much money, most likely. But in a bad year, you'll lose 10%. This risk-reward presentation will likely be big enough that Mr. or Mrs. Customer will look at the amount of reward, take a quick look at the amount of risk and say, yeah, that's acceptable, we'll do that. So risk-based framing is a very powerful way to help Mr. and Mrs. Customer overcome their loss aversion and make a financial decision that would be in their best interests. Now, the third and final frame is actually the most powerful in any long-term financial planning decision, whether this be the kind of mortgage or house you buy or the kind of investment plan you take for retirement or your kid's wedding or education. This is a goal-based frame. Now, the trick behind this one is we need to know in advance of the presentation what kind of goal we want to talk about. And so as an effective means to get to this conversation, it's pretty important that you get your client to paint you a picture of what that goal is. So it could be, I want to have 1,000 people at the wedding and I want it to look this way and be beside the ocean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It could be, I want to live a lifestyle in my retirement where I spend half the year traveling around the world and I live near my family and I have this kind of car. The point is, if you want to use a goal-based frame most effectively as either a marketing tool or a sales tool during a conversation, you need your customer to tell you in vivid detail, enough that you can picture this goal that they have. And then, different than the other two frames, once that picture is painted, that goal is clear, you then present a negative frame. What you do then is you would then say, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, if you take this path with no risk, there's a good chance that you will not meet this, you will not have this goal. This will kind of become a fantasy that you don't have. So from a digital perspective, if you're not having a one-to-one conversation about this in a UX or a user experience frame, what you might do is you might have a big warning that says, based on the choices that you're making, the goal that you described earlier will not be met. You need to make this choice or that choice. So the negative frame is probably the most powerful when we're using goal-based frames, but it's most relevant and most, let's just say it's going to be the most powerful or impactful to your bottom line growth and your customer success only when you have a vivid understanding of what that goal is, and then can present the possibility that the client won't realize that goal. So those are my 3 pieces on frames and how they can be used from a marketing and a sales context in the financial services industry. Of course, these are broadly applicable to any category of business that you're in, but I like these examples best. I hope that they were useful to you and that you can find some way to apply these in your business. And of course, I'm always happy to answer questions. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or you want to talk about this in more depth. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.